All right, so folks, welcome to the Quincy Institute's webinar titled The Trump Doctrine, a conversation with Aslı Bâli and Aziz Rana. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a foreign policy think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on military restraint and diplomacy. In the recent absolutely must-read Boston Review essay, and I should mention that this webinar is co-hosted or co-sponsored by Boston Review, the Quincy Institute's non-resident fellows, Aslı Bâli and Aziz Rana, argued that the emerging Trump doctrine replaces multilateralism and international law with an open-ended coercion, economic punishment, and the normalization of dominance over weaker states. Crucially, they trace this framework back to the Biden administration's policy on Gaza and how it treats sovereignty as conditional and wields sanctions, blockades, and force not as a last resort, but as a primary tool of policy. Today, this doctrine reverberates from the Middle East to the Caribbean as Israel was permitted to impose a siege on Gaza and prevent food and medicine from reaching civilians. Critics warn that similar coercive logics are resurfacing elsewhere. So, for instance, in Cuba, the Trump administration is deepening shortages of food, fuel, and medicine through a naval blockade on the island, prompting accusations of collective punishment. In Iran, the US and Israel are bombing universities, desalination plants, and pharmaceutical factories. What came permissible in Gaza is now becoming employed elsewhere, eroding decades of international norms designed to protect civilians. Aslı and Aziz are with us to help unpack all of this. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. If you're watching this on Twitter, on Facebook or YouTube, you can put your questions in the comment section and we'll try to get to those as well. So with no further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Aslı Bâli is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and professor at Yale Law School. Her research focuses on two broad areas: public international law and comparative constitutional law, with a focus on the Middle East. Her scholarship has appeared in all the major law journals in the world. I cannot go through all the full list here. Aziz Rana is a non-resident fellow as well at the Quincy Institute and professor of law and government at Boston College. His research and teaching center on American constitutional law and political development. He is the author of The Two Faces of American Freedom from 2010, a book that situates the American experience within the global history of colonialism. His current book manuscript, Rise of the Constitution, explores the modern rise of constitutional veneration in the 20th century. So, Aslı and Aziz, we're delighted to have us with you. I would like to give you all both 3 minutes or so to just lay out the key thesis that you're putting forward in your Boston Review article, and from there we'll go into deeper questions. Aziz, you want to start off?
Sure. Can folks hear me? Well, yes. First, thank you so much, Trita, for that lovely introduction. I should say that my second book, ultimately titled The Constitutional Bind, How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Them, recently was published, and so it's out there as well. But it's wonderful to be here and to be able to have an opportunity to engage with the Quincy Institute and all of the folks that are watching as well. So what I thought I would do for just a couple minutes, maybe up front, is give a bit of an overview about how we were thinking about this moment in American foreign policy. And you'll notice that in thinking about this last year, up to and including the US's war on Iran, there have basically been two approaches. Approach number one is to say, wait a second, all of this is a break. The US was the guarantor of a global international order that was based on rules, and that Trump is a violation of a basic premise of American life. Another approach, and you see this maybe more extensively on the left, is to say all of this is basically the same. There was gunboat diplomacy in the 19th century. We're seeing gunboat diplomacy now. Empire is continuous. And what we wanted to argue was that we could really understand the US in this moment as a story of both continuity, but also rupture. And so I'll just maybe very quickly trace a bit of this in broad strokes from post-45, and then maybe turn it over to Aslı to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the elements of the piece. The way in which you can think of American power, especially in the period between 45 and the fall of the Soviet Union, is that the US established a set of norms post-World War II based on multilateralism and rule following that it understood as essential to its own global authority. So it read constitutionalism domestically as part of what the US provides to the global stage and what's different than, let's say, the imperial orders that preceded it. But the thought behind this was that for this system to work, there would have to be a single hegemon, American primacy, a single country that could step outside of the rules to ensure that there were no rogue nations, that folks were basically engaged in rule following, and that the world did not collapse into something like World War III. And the thing that you'll notice about that dynamic is it meant that the US basically viewed its own obeying of the rules themselves as something that was dependent on its assessment of national security, because how it understood its own national security interests were essentially coterminous with the world's interests. And so the period from 45 to 90, if you just look at US violations of the norms, incredibly extensive. The US backed what amounted to and what scholars refer to as a genocide in Indonesia, various coup attempts, illegal bombing campaigns in the context of Vietnam, covert operations, the assassination of elected officials, including, for instance, in Iran in '53. So you have a continuous violation of norms, but the idea is that this violation is part and parcel of sustaining an overall system. And so the basic story, in a way that perhaps is surprising, is rule defection, but at the same time, a commitment by the US, both in terms of domestic stories of legitimation, but also how it interacts with other actors globally for the rules themselves. And this is also reinforced by the fact that there is another global power in the Soviet Union. And so the US has to win hearts and minds vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. That means massive investments in elements of the global South. It means a commitment to making good on ideas of rule following. And so it's this back and forth that defines the era. And then what happens essentially with the collapse of the Soviet Union is that the external constraints on the US to say that there are these reasons globally why the US really needs consensual buy-in start to disappear. And so post-'89, it's not that the US just absolutely decides to defect entirely from a premise about rules. And indeed, the US invests in new multilateral institutions, like, for instance, the World Trade Organization, efforts at international economic integration, and then a commitment to various kinds of multilateral and regional organizations, especially when it comes to the global north, places in Europe. But what also happens is that the Middle East in particular becomes a testing ground for a new set of policies, where precisely because of the fact that the US is now globally unconstrained, and it increasingly views events in the Middle East as effectively part of its near abroad because of the desire for access to energy, issues about containing Iran, commitments to Israel and Israeli security, that what ends up happening in the Middle East really from the 90s to the present is a steady and systematic defection from the rules themselves, including, relatedly, to new international agreements. The US plays a central role in drafting the ICC, the Rome Statute, but then effectively, because of its own actions in the Middle East, refuses to end up committing to signing it. And then we can see this play out fairly continuously with some limitations, for instance, in the context of the Obama nuclear deal in 2015, up through the Biden administration. And then post-October 7th, the Biden administration's absolute complicity in Israel's actions, including what scholars, human rights activists, international organizations end up calling a genocide in Gaza, essentially speaks to the extent to which the rules themselves have been utterly swallowed by the willingness of the US to engage in systematic defection. And that's the circumstance under which Trump takes over. And what Trump effectively does is he engages in a continuation of that rules defection in a way in which now the vision that's being presented is that multilateral institutions themselves are a constraint on American power, and that the only way to actually defend the US is to re-entrench a commitment to regional hegemony in its near abroad, so Latin America, this is the emphasis on Venezuela, on Cuba, et cetera, with the treatment of the Middle East as effectively still part of its near abroad, and a view of multilateral constraint and international law as what actually undermines the U.S. global position. So a commitment to coercion, to the exclusion of a previous framework of consent, and moreover, to an approach now that treats really the international rules themselves, precisely because they're a threat, as a site for direct assault. So the U.S. is now engaged in effectively taking apart the rules that established American hegemony in 1945. And so this is a long story of continuity, but also rupture.
Aslı.
Yeah, let me just jump in and maybe Aziz did a beautiful job of providing really the long history of the moment that we've arrived at. So I think like the best thing I could do is maybe just punctuate a couple of points, and then we can move to thinking about how our piece applies to the present conundrum, because of course we wrote this before the Iran war. And actually it was a culmination of a series of pieces we've been writing in the Boston Review over basically beginning with the Trump administration, at least in this line. So we had, America's imperial unraveling, our piece that was on sanctions in 2020, and now this Trump doctrine. And exactly as Aziz says, these are stories of continuity, but also that keep applying our argument in an updated fashion to new expressions of the ways in which the United States is positioning itself in this global order. So, I mean, the first thing I would say that's continuous is, as Aziz says, through the Cold War and then after the Cold War, the U.S. is engaging in forms of aggressive unilateralism across the board, but they were presented at one time as being justified in the service of multilateralism. And now instead, it's a kind of aggressive unilateralism that's literally at war with multilateralism. So it's going directly after the institutions themselves. And this, just to bring us up to the present, we just got the longue durée, but it's really important to understand the continuities of the Biden administration and the degree to which, and we can talk about this more as we get into the conversation, but key decisions made and key decision makers beyond Biden himself, people like Jake Sullivan, people like John Boehner, that are now being turned to as kind of responsible statesmen capable of stewarding wise choices, were themselves authors of these decisions, right? So that these are the kinds of things that we saw: expanded executive discretion, which is a secular story, but that the Biden administration absolutely doubled down on, including around war powers, or including around insulating administrative choices by the administration from meaningful legislative scrutiny or any kind of interrogation, including in moments where those choices were deeply unpopular. And Gaza is a really fundamental expression of this, ever increasing increments of military and financial support for essentially direct and indirect expressions of U.S. military policy, never justified, never pursuing any of the either internal constitutional constraints or complying with international law. The instrumental use of international law to selectively legitimate particular projects, for example, in Ukraine, and requiring a sort of compulsory participation in the economic statecraft that the United States decided to pursue to isolate Russia, while completely abandoning international law and international law frameworks when they became inconvenient in assessing Gaza or other engagements that the United States was willing to support, Yemen and elsewhere. Trump amplified rather than inventing these trends. So then we titled our piece, using this phrase, the Trump doctrine, not because we think Trump has a coherent doctrine, which he absolutely does not have, but rather because all of these approaches crystallized latent tendencies already present in U.S. policy, but expressed them in the most extreme ways. So open rejection of international institutional constraint, totally transactional approach to alliances where it's like explicitly made to be pay to play, but because of those earlier defections in which the United States increasingly was willing at its own discretion to abandon both the rules and the institutional constraints and the interest of other allies on its own judgment, this is not a new, I mean, obviously the degree of its transactionalism, the attempt to extort literal financial kickbacks and payment to the individuals within the administration is a novel dimension, but the transactional approach to alliances is not. And the use of economic coercion, tariffs, sanctions as primary tools. These are on a continuum with choices that the Biden administration and administrations prior to the Biden administration had long been using. What is maybe most clear in Trump is the total abandonment of normative claims about the purposes of U.S. power used in this way. Not only is it not tied to an agenda of the, now antiquated language around democracy, promotion, human rights, et cetera, that you still heard sort of limping along under the Obama administration, but less and less so in the Biden administration. But it's not even tethered to normative claims about the ways in which this is a stabilizing force for the international community writ large. So it really, what we tried to highlight in the essay is the degree that the legal constraints on unilateral action had already been stretched to the breaking point well before Trump, certainly before Trump too, but already even at the end of the Obama administration, because of the normalization of these choices of defection, many of which were made most visible in the war on terror context. And what the global implications then of this are, and I'll just end here, is not just the weakening of alliances and institutions, but certainly that, also the normalization of increasing increments of unilateral coercion to pursue policy ends. And all of this accelerates not just in multipolarism. So the irony here is these are, in many cases, self-inflicted wounds to the US's own capacity to wield credibility, legitimacy, and ultimately soft power in an international system in which it's no longer got the same sort of uncontested monopoly on forms of hard power because it faces actual regional competitors in a variety of arenas. So it's an acceleration of multipolarity away from unipolarity, but not towards a multipolar order that is within some kind of global international institutional framework, but rather that is increasingly unconstrained altogether, less rule-bound in every conceivable way, less capable of being held within a single set of global institutions, and more likely to devolve into precisely what the so-called Dunroe doctrine imagines, which is regional silos no longer capable of being put together in any multilateral format.
Thank you so much, both you, Asla and Aziz, for a fantastic explanation of this. I want to go deeper. I had some questions in mind, but before I go into those, I want to stress test one thing, because you're laying out a history in which the actual assault on the multilateral institutions tend to come somewhat late in the game. That prior to this, even though there was a lot of defections from international law, etc., there wasn't a real systematic assault. As you were talking, I pulled up this article from Richard Pearl on the very same day that the United States invades Iraq in 2003, 20th of March, in The Guardian. The title of the article is "Thank God for the Death of the UN." And he goes on to say that, Saddam is terrible, but what will die with Saddam's regime is the fantasy of the UN as a foundation of a new order. And he essentially makes the case for getting rid of all of these type of UN constraints on the United States, and says that what is needed is a coalition of the willing to govern the world going forward. And then, of course, you have famously John Bolton becoming UN ambassador, and his goal is to go there and essentially say no one would notice if the entire UN building was burnt down. The very profound view that these multilateral institutions do nothing but constrain American power, and as a result, they're of no particular value. How would you, and this is the neoconservative movement, this was not a parenthesis, how would you fit that in this larger arc of history and evolution of these this approach towards norms and the multilateral system?
If I could, I'll maybe take this very quickly, and then Aziz, I'll turn over to you. But I think it's an interesting moment. First of all, it's so curious to think about Richard Pearl, who was once described as the Prince of Darkness, writing in the pages of The Guardian. That in and of itself is reason to preserve that as an artifact of a particular moment. But I do think there were many people around the Bush administration during the Iraq invasion that understood themselves in these terms, right? That they were going to war also to free the U.S. Gulliver held back by the Lilliputians, et cetera, to really express at a moment when the war on terror was at its, in its earliest phases, sort of naked capacity to coercively reshape the world in an image that was stamped by American understandings of what security required, et cetera. But I would say within a year, in a way, Bush and his entourage learned the chastening lesson that Trump may be on the precipice of learning himself at this moment. To begin with, there's a huge difference between, and a difference that was at the time decried by Richard Perle and John Bolton and others, right? The US spent 2 years or a year and a half trying to build a literal international legal case for the war in Iraq, claiming that prior UN Security Council resolutions already authorized it, that Iraq represented this major threat, et cetera. And they were, of course, frustrated because the Council, and surprisingly enough, not just Russia and China, but France, fundamentally rejected those arguments. And in fact, we later learned within the UK government itself, their own legal office was saying no. But the degree of concern around UN and getting that imprimatur was really clear. It was only the failure of that led them to now express this contempt. Well, within less than 12 months, they were back at the UN Security Council essentially saying, we couldn't assemble a large enough coalition to distribute the costs of this disastrous conflict that elective war that we launched. Now we've suffered these self-inflicted wounds and we need assistance. And they had to get a UN Security Council resolution to essentially approve the post-invasion infrastructure, bring in the UN, force them to burden share around the humanitarian and regional security costs of what they had unleashed. And so the UN becomes implicated again. And of course, the UN's not able to avoid this because the US remains a hegemonic power that is capable of destroying the institution when it doesn't engage in this kind of action. And the allies were willing to do it. Trump is not going to have this available to him. I think the universe in which the UN or Europeans are going to go along with a cleanup project for a grotesque use of American unilateral coercive force without international legal imprimatur in Iran is zero. And that's in part because of the loss of credibility that very moment that you described represents. But it is worth understanding the distinction, what's continuous and what's different, right? What's continuous is exactly the kinds of logics you just described, in which at least one cohort of people informing American policy view international law and international institution as a kind of irritant and constraint that prevents the United States from exercising the full expanse of its powers. The lessons that were learned in that moment, including by that very coterie of people, is that it's extremely costly, unsustainably so even for the most powerful state in the system. And the US was far more powerful in 2003, 2004 than it is today as a relative matter. That it is unsustainable through pure coercion and hard power to actually see through the strategic objectives that they have. Whatever they think they can achieve by coercion, very quickly they realize that they are not in control of the outcomes that they set in motion by engaging in that initial act of coercion, and they actually need to distribute those costs. The UN was still available as an actor to facilitate that project in 2004, and the Bush administration abandoned that way of speaking. And the Bolton ambassadorship notwithstanding, the US as a practical matter actually engaged systematically with the UN under Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, et cetera, and returned to its previous view of the UN as an element of its own arsenal of statecraft rather than as an external constraint.
Very interesting. Aziz, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the thing that I would say is that it's really important to appreciate that in the post-war period, the US is dealing with bipolarity and it's dealing with global decolonization. And it's also dealing with the rest of domestic population. So this is the era of the civil rights movement, labor unrest. And one of the things that American national elites have to essentially develop is an argument about well, what makes the US different? Why is it that the US should have global primacy and it won't necessarily operate the same way that these other imperial hegemons have behaved in the past? And the idea of the US is committed to a vision of constitutional democracy, both domestically, but then also internationally and within the international system, becomes really central to its self-definition. And then when the Soviet Union collapses, there's a real question about, well, to what extent have the types of constraints that the US has imposed on itself, should they remain in effect? And basically, I think what you see is a steady, decades-long defection from really the bipartisan foreign policy establishment of which neocons are a part, of the kinds of constraints that had been seen as justified. And so when Pearl has comments like this, or the language that you see in the early 2000s, it's an indicator of already a decade-long process of defecting from the idea that these systems actually sustain American interest. But I think it's really noteworthy two things. First, the point that Aslı made, which is in the context of the first Gulf War, in the context of the second Gulf War, in the context of Afghanistan, American elites, even those that are affiliated with neoconservatism, are still committed to the idea of laws providing legitimacy for the use of force. Domestic uses of force authorizations, so you have a domestic conversation about it. The turn to the UN Security Council as a way of providing international legitimacy for the use of force, that's still part of the story. And secondly, that even the neoconservative argument about why you should abandon international institutions is still grounded in a claim about the exceptional American role in establishing a global community committed to something like constitutional democracy. The thought is that these international constraints, precisely because you have dictatorships that are involved in like the UN's Human Rights Council, these are the kinds of arguments that were made, they actually undermine the ability of generating something like local democracy. There's a claim about other directed interest that's connected to American intervention. And basically, I think one of the things that we've seen, now this is not to say that the actual violence that ended up being perpetrated in places like Iraq weren't incredibly destructive for the region, produced, failed states and collapsed regimes, and countless death, intense human suffering. But it is to say that the through line that we trace is not just the defection from the commitment to international norms and law, but increasingly the lesson that, let's say, the folks now invested in regime change and war on Iran, the lesson that was learned is that that entire kind of vision of American exceptionalism, of a kind of moral frame for American power, that itself was the problem. That actually you can't promote something like democracy in the Middle East. This is the investment in the idea basically of an ethno-national civilizational vision of the world that's divided between distinct communities. It's not a surprise that the folks that are prosecuting a war on Iran right now also are backing immigration policies, for instance, that would have 70 plus countries either totally or partially banned from entering, all in the global south, overwhelmingly in Africa and the Middle East. This is to say, the assault now is on the very idea of nation building, the very premise that U.S. power is supposed to be connected to a vision of spreading democracy. And so it's a rejection of international law, it's a rejection of the underlying premises of moral authority, and a reconstruction of the globe really around a very harsh Manichaean us versus them, in which the U.S. has its own sphere of influence that it's supposed to dominate, including through extractive resource practices and through the imposition through coercion of its own needs and ends.
So this is not a scenario in which you can turn against the idea of America playing a role as a nation builder, as the force that has to push for democracy in various places, whether they ask for it or not. In general, because you can take that position without necessarily believing that the reason you should be against that is because these other people are simply culturally or civilizationally not fit for democracy. You're essentially saying that there is a view that is actually quite popular in the sense that the US should step back from these different things, but the ones that are running the show right now are coming to this view from a completely different angle, from a civilizational standpoint, in which essentially it is not that it's good or bad for the US, this is just an impossible task because there are profound differences in civilization, and American power is not sufficient to be able to overcome that. Do I understand you correctly?
Yeah, so this is part of the misreading, in my view, of Trump as anti-war or even like anti-imperial 2015, 2016, which is the thing that Trump was able to give voice to was that there was intense, kind of within the conservative Republican Party base, opposition to the Iraq War, and in particular to the projects of nation building. And the way that Trump, I think, ultimately gave voice to this was that the reason why these wars failed, and this is the politics of race that plays out with the Republican Party and Trumpist politics now, the reason why these wars ultimately failed is because of limitations, cultural limitations within the societies that the US was attempting to transform. And so that the lesson that's learned is that we should not be engaged. It's not that the US shouldn't engage in aggressive, extractive, coercive practices, including like overthrowing regimes, et cetera, et cetera. It's that the US should not be engaged in the kind of forever wars that are attempting to transform other societies into variations of the US. So that it's not a surprise in 2015, 2016 that he both attacks Jeb Bush because of Jeb Bush's continuity with like the Bush dynasty and the Iraq War, and calls for a Muslim ban. And that this is a moment in time, if you look at the charts of like the rise of hate crimes, that you see a spike in hate crimes with respect to Muslim people in the United States.
And on top of that, criticizes Bush for not taking the oil after having invaded.
Exactly. So the thought is that precisely because there are these quote unquote inherent flaws in societies that are not like us, we need to have a fortress wall that limits their ability to come in. And we have to have a posture of basically xenophobic belligerence. And that posture of xenophobic belligerence may well include the use of extreme forms of violence as a way of imposing dominance, extracting resources and assets. But what it's not supposed to do is engage in transformational efforts to actually alter those states in ways that would be consistent with the practices associated with the United States. And so it's setting the stage effectively for a vision of the world that's divided ethno-racially, that imagines the US as as an ethno-national state, and that treats enemies, outside of the fortress as appropriate sites for, profound acts of violence inconsistent with both a theory of law. So lawless, both domestic and international, that's out the window. But also as you're not interested in necessarily like altering the terms of the leadership. So if you can find Adelcy Rodriguez, that's great. If what you have instead is state collapse, that's fine, so long as you're able to exercise control over the primary assets and maintain your own sense of security and dominance behind the fortress wall. This is an extension of elements within the rights coalition that really comes to the fore with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the limitations on constraints on a kind of post-war politics. But it's also the victory, let's say, of one element within right-wing politics with respect to how to relate to the rest of the world.
Aslı, you want to come in?
I want to come in on just one. First of all, I agree absolutely with everything that Aziz said, and the whole like asylum for white Afrikaners only, et cetera, is just like there are so many ways that we can trace the connections to AfD, that vision of a world in which this form of white nationalism, like who are we actually connected to civilizationally, whose interests matter, et cetera, is expressed very nakedly and clearly through the Trump administration. But I want to think about the other corollary, the places where we don't have those civilizational stakes and that are outside of the fortress walls, et cetera. There's another element of, let's call it the doctrines premises, which is a kind of doubling down on asymmetry, building a kind of controlled asymmetry that rests on a very specific bet. And this too is an extension of earlier views that were present not just amongst conservatives that really reflect a bipartisan understanding of US power as it became less and less constrained in the 21st century, that the US can just apply intense economic and selective military pressure to shape outcomes and bend geographies to its will, willy-nilly, whether or not you're going to try, nation building. You can drop all of that, but still have the desire to have this kind of extractive transactional relationship, and where places resist, coerce them into participating in that scheme. And this is especially expressed in the Trump administration, as we point out in the piece, against adversaries that are assumed to be structurally weaker and also rationally are therefore believed to be escalation averse, meaning because they're in a weaker position, we're going to use this overwhelming force and they're going to bend to our will. And Venezuela is the best example of a success for those who believe in this method, that you can avoid full-scale war, you can get your ends, and you can do it purely through coercion. And Iran is almost the ideal stress test, to borrow your phrase, again, Trita, for this logic. I mean, it was treated as, economically vulnerable, sanctions dependent, facing a significant pressure point, both through sanctions and the internal unrest that economic conditions in Iran had produced, January, protests in Iran, militarily inferior in conventional terms with an important American ally that has qualitative military advantage as a consequence of a long-term, again, bipartisan American foreign policy commitment to preserve its qualitative military superiority, namely Israel. And Iran is more regionally constrained. Its proxies have taken a knock, et cetera. So this is a place where coercion should be able to be applied exactly in the straightforward way to bend actors to the will and without really facing any meaningful retaliation, because Iran is another classic example of punching down. And of course, what it has done is expose the total limits once more, and here are the echoes again of the Iraq War, of this kind of a strategy, because the current war shows all the ways that these premises break down. First of all, asymmetry cuts in more than one direction. Iran may not be able to match the United States conventionally, but it doesn't need to do that. It can respond. They've underestimated regional proxies. They apparently, which is astonishing given the amount of American intelligence on specifically this issue, failed to anticipate maritime disruption. And also, Iran is capable of incremental escalation of its own that stays well below the war threshold of conventional war that they were thinking of, while ratcheting pressure in a way that means that coercion turns into a feedback loop, that they're not at all escalation averse in the ways that the United States imagined, even though they are asymmetrically positioned. And so it's not the one-sided campaign that Trump imagined he would be punching down to. And so first, asymmetry cuts both ways. Second, sanctions and pressure don't always produce lack of resistance or compliance, quite the opposite. As we pointed out in an earlier piece, in the sanctions piece we wrote in the Boston Review, actually this kind of selective coercion can harden instead of softening the target. We can harden the regime. We're seeing that in real time right now. It can expand risk tolerance or pain tolerance, right, by forcing countries into a more and more resilient posture, which is exactly what the effect has been long-term of sanctions in the Iranian context. At great cost, of course, to the target, but not in a way that's also not costly for the strategy continued on the part of the US. And it might shift incentives towards escalation rather than concession, because you've already taught the lesson that concession breeds more coercion, which again, the United States has done in spades in Iran. So it's exposing the limits. Asymmetry cuts both ways. Sanction and pressure do not necessarily produce compliance. And finally, escalation ceilings are totally illusory. Your belief that you're punching down, you engage in a selective, coercive act, and you can calibrate the pressure precisely and stay in control of the dynamics you've unleashed are just absolutely false. And so each step is met with a counter step. The line between so-called limited strikes or an operation and not a war erodes in ways that has nothing, that is totally outside of the control of the United States. And this is also what happened in the Iraq context, right? This is the story of how the US ended up having to distribute the cost of its fundamental error in the first place. So what was meant to be this kind of controlled coercion, another application of the US asymmetric power to shape the world in its own preferred manner, becomes an open-ended conflict with a kind of drift that is tied, and I'm going to stop here, but this is really like I'm telling you the chain of our work, mine and Aziz's, it's tied right back to imperial unraveling. This is coercion without control, without an image of, the US, of course, is still able to wield overwhelming tools of coercion, but it has absolutely diminished its ability to shape outcomes predictably, in part as a consequence of its own dismantling of institutions that help channel political disputes in particular ways, and also the fundamental structural overreach that's necessary when you abandon the logic of institutions that embed and entrench a kind of legitimate or consensual structural organization of the globe in your favor, which is what the original multilateral UN model was, and instead rely on pure coercion. Then you have a kind of structural overreach in which the Trump doctrine fails on its own terms. Its own relative power asymmetry that favors the United States not only can't guarantee control over escalation, but may actually work in the advantage of its adversary in a fragmented, networked regional order in which pain can be distributed quickly and at low cost by an asymmetrically weaker rival.
Thank you, Asla. So I want to one more question on this, and then we do need to get to you know, the specifics of Gaza and how that's influencing the situation today. But one thing that comes out of this is that there is a continuity, but there is a significant escalation with Trump and his doctrine, because he's now going completely against multilateral institutions, whereas even the Biden administration, which I was very critical of how they approached the UN, was looking for this RBIO, rules-based international order, as an alternative to a law-centered order. But could there, as a result, be simply that Trump is actually an exception? He is a continuation, but he's also an exception because he takes that extra step that the previous administrations didn't do. And as a result, the US will revert back to still a highly problematic approach, where it's continuing to erode a lot of these different norms, continuing to undermine the multilateral system as a whole, but without this type of naked assault on the system per se, or the rejection of the very idea that these laws even should exist or should be given any reference to whatsoever.
I'm going to come in very quickly and then pass on to Aziz to say that was a story that could have been told in Trump 1, I think, that this is an exception, that there's an underlying norm, there's a bipartisan consensus, the US will return to form, et cetera. That requires an international order that's willing to subscribe to institutions that it believes are backstopped by a form of US power in which the US is believed to be capable of resuming a guarantor role, et cetera. I do think at this point that that is no longer an available option, that I don't think any future US administration is going to be able to offer the assurances that would be needed, or suggest that they are subject to the constraints that are relevant to make others in the international system accept the idea that the US can play a stabilizing role. It's just proven itself too unstable internally and too much of a rogue. Now, no longer, as I said, using it. Once upon a time, states went along with American unilateralism, even when it involved forms of coercion that they fundamentally disagreed with, secondary sanctions, all kinds of things, because they believed that at base, the US was continuing to subscribe to an underlying commitment to multilateralism. I think the capacity to elicit that belief in others is now broken. That isn't to say that there's no path back to international law or international institutions, because I do think ultimately a world ordered, the alternative to that model is not a different multilateral system that also is of global scope, et cetera, but rather, as I said, the really nightmarish scenario of regional silos, et cetera, which is going to be worse overall for all states, right? It's much more conflict prone, much likelier to devolve into a World War III rapidly. So other states have an incentive in preserving the rules and the institutions, but they don't any longer have a reason to believe that the United States would serve as the guarantor. So the problem is, how do you then overcome the collective action problem, which is how do you get those states to act collectively in a way that is in all of their interest, but involve first of all, internalizing some costs, and second of all, bearing a much larger share of responsibility for preserving the order. So the UN is a great test case in this moment. The Trump administration is on the brink of bankrupting the United Nations. We may face a situation in which it literally can no longer keep the lights on, pay its basic staff as it is. It's devolving in many respects at this moment. We're talking about a ludicrously small sum of money, which is a rounding error on the daily cost of the war on Iran at this moment. And yet somehow we have yet to see overcoming of the collective action problem of just adding this tiny increment of capital to sustaining a multilateral system in order to get through this Trump period, and then have it still in existence for whatever comes after, which is never going to be a return to a US authored system as such, but at least a system in which the US can be one amongst a series of players. But even this very tiny hurdle is being difficult to overcome. So it's hard to see exactly how it's going to happen. Aziz, sorry.
Yeah, no, so I mean, just totally agree that you could tell a story. In fact, this was the Biden story in 2021 about a return to normalcy, that Trump as a kind of exceptional moment that's been defeated, and actually Trump himself might be prosecuted and convicted for an effort to overturn a democratically elected president. The problem basically is that Trump's return has essentially scrambled calculations about long-term U.S. credibility, and in particular, the idea that you can count on the U.S. as both a global security backstop and a global backstop for international legal arrangements. That, in the past, even if the U.S. was defecting precisely because it saw the system itself as in its own interests, that you can assume that the U.S. would behave in ways that were thinking about long-term commitments. The problem, of course, now is if there's a growing recognition of fundamental American instability, then that essentially suggests that the only way that you can get to a path that looks like even a commitment to the old-fashioned set of norms is through some new multipolar arrangement that's not premised on American primacy. So there's that. The other thing that I would just note that I think is a really significant issue is the fact that all of these dynamics that we're talking about at the global level have their own parallels domestically within the United States. Because we can tell this exact same story about how the post-war period in the US established a basic set of constitutional practices that were supposed to define what amounted to an American constitutional compact, from racial liberalism to a limited social welfare state to a commitment checks and balances to regulation of market capitalism with an administrative infrastructure, and then internationally to the promotion of all of these different elements, including civil liberties, human rights norms, through a set of international arrangements. And basically, you can argue that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, one of the things that it did is it meant that the types of pressures that constrained not just the left, so we think of the Cold War as a period of crackdowns on socialist politics, left politics in the US, but also constrained the far right by creating incentive structures for the center right to understand this compact as consistent with its own partisan objectives. That stuff was removed. And effectively, what's happened is that the right has increasingly embraced a brand of politics that we can read as fundamentalist in lots of different ways. So rejection of racial liberalism, a rejection of constraints on the markets, a rejection of checks and balances, including a defense of an incredibly aggressive form of executive authority. So that we're at a moment in time where Trump also embodies an assault on the basic premises of American constitutionalism that had been chipped away, frankly, in a bipartisan mode for decades, but now is experiencing a kind of collapse where it's possible that Democrats might take over in 2026 and that you might have a Democratic president in 2028, presuming that we have more or less functional elections. That's likely to happen. But there is no presumption that you can put the genie back in the bottle, that you can either return to an earlier historical moment or that you can assume transformation on behalf of something that's more genuinely a practice of constitutional democracy. And instead, you have this combination of paralysis and uncertainty and of one new incumbent perhaps being replaced by another incumbent that, again, even more aggressively attacks the premises of law. And so these internal dynamics are interplaying with the international dynamics in ways that make it very hard to imagine a stable international order that would view the U.S. as one of the pillars of that stability.
Interesting. We have a question from the audience from Jim Loeb is, what role does Israel and its exceptionalism play in the Monroe Doctrine, especially when Israeli actions become a wedge issue between the U.S. and its NATO European allies? Does Israel have a specific place in the Monroe Doctrine? And I would just like to add to that, if you could give the examples of how the conduct of Israel in Gaza, which really appeared to look like a war on international law itself, trying to erase all of those different norms around the use of force. It's fascinating to see in the beginning, it was a denial that there was any bombing of hospitals. Later on, it was no denials, instead of saying, well, obviously we're bombing the hospitals, Hamas is there. There was a charade every time they killed a journalist, saying, well, this was accidental, we're going to investigate it. Now they actually announced it themselves, we got that journalist, in which they just fundamentally changed the reality. And we see some of that also playing out in the war on Iran right now. The United States, with whatever flaws it had in the inceptional error of attacking and invading Iraq, did not bomb Iraqi universities deliberately. But we are now seeing that that was absolutely deliberately done in Gaza, and it is now also being done in Tehran, what appears to be the Israelization of American form of warfare. So could you address Jim's question as well as give us the history of how Israel's conduct has come to play a role, whatever the role that is, in the Donroe Doctrine?
Maybe I'll start again, Aziz, if you want. So first of all, I think that this description is exactly right, particularly the sharply placed description you gave, Trita, of the ways in which we're seeing constraints thrown off in real time as new interpretations are being promulgated by the Israelis, where they no longer even need to dissemble that they're not targeting directly hospitals, universities, school systems, infrastructure, et cetera. I think that this is not new. I think that this was a project as far back as the mid-90s on the part of particular Israeli elites, at least, and Benjamin Netanyahu put it in writing, essentially, that he had a vision for a kind of new American order for the Middle East and Israel's place in that order. And so just on the Donroe Doctrine point, I would say, as Aziz mentioned earlier, there's a way in which the Middle East itself is presented as part of America's near abroad, another sphere that must be within its own regional influence. And Israel is the, kind of garrison state where the U.S. has planted its flag more than any others, although it has a diversified structure of alliances, including the Gulf, and we're seeing the consequences of those alliances now, Arab Gulf countries. Israel is the core partner and articulation of the American vision for the region, and we can see in the Iran war that it's also its interests, its understanding of strategic objectives is prioritized in a way that is all but coterminous with whatever the U.S. is also itself pursuing in the region, whether that is sustainable given the obvious underlying divergence of interest of the two countries, with Israel having a particular set of goals for outcomes that it wants to see in the region, including apparently the collapse of numerous states across the region. Whether that remains consistent with American strategic goals is a separate question. But for the moment, I would say fits pretty squarely in a Donroe Doctrine. I'd be interested to hear if Aziz thinks of it in the same way. But on the other question, the one that you asked, Trita, I mean, the U.S., as far back as immediately after 9/11, began embracing a set of new international humanitarian law, or jus in bello, like laws of war doctrines that the Israelis had already introduced in the 90s. So you get Operation Grapes of Wrath in southern Lebanon under Shimon Peres, which basically is the breaking of the Rabin sort of model of labor governance in Israel. And it becomes the segue to Netanyahu's first turn as prime minister. And in that turn, the Palestinian question is turned from one that's going to be resolved through a diplomatic path or in any way in a peace process to one that's entirely going to be securitized and is about increasing increments of repression and full militarization of the project, beginning in 96, I would say, with Netanyahu's first premiership. And then you have the introduction of things like, for example, targeted killing as somehow different than extrajudicial killing, which is not permitted, and redescription of civilians, civilian political leadership, civilian actors as somehow directly participating in hostilities. These categories existed in international humanitarian law, but they're expanded. They're expanded in ways that basically systematically blurs or eliminates the distinction between military and civilian targets in a series of incremental doctrinal moves that were Israel's alone, widely rejected, ICRC and others in the 90s, even in the early 2000s, until the US begins embracing them. The idea that there are irregular combatants of a variety of kinds that don't get the benefits of the privileges of belligerency under the Geneva Conventions in Afghanistan, that there are enemy combatants that are not, or that don't get the benefit of being treated as actually participating in a regular combat force, even though they're waging war in the military of an organized state, and so on. So like the Israelification of, or the adoption by the United States of various doctrinal let's call them innovations that emerge from the IDF legal office, has a long pedigree and is really like part of the story of the war on terror. And then as the United States and Israel jointly announce more and more of these, unable or unwilling, you can override the sovereignty of states and use force on the territory of a state without its consent on the grounds that you're going after a non-state actor. Again, there are arguments around this that crystallize into the explicit embrace of doctrine, and then the claim that this doctrine has now become customary international law. Why? Because there's so much state practice behind it. What state practice? Israel and the United States. But of course, the United States is in so many theaters at once. Once it embraces some of these doctrines, it begins to try to generalize them. And as NATO allies and others concede to some of them, although even the UK is limited in its own conduct in Iraq from embracing many of the reinterpretations that the US uses, also, for example, enhanced interrogation and trying to fudge what constitutes torture, another doctrinal borrowing or expansion of an Israeli set of strategies. But there's the European Court of Human Rights. There are actual constraints of a kind that other actors face that the United States doesn't face. The US, unconstrained, has a State Department, Defense Department, sets of lawyers that are in and out of academia as well, that continually insist that these are doctrines that are lawful somehow or are meaningful reinterpretations of existing law, until you get to the point, as you say, where we're at genocide, we're at Gaza, we're at siege warfare, we're at collective punishment, we're at starvation of civilian populations, and still arguments are being furnished such that Cuba can be presented somehow as some amalgam of the US has a unilateral right in its own trade relations to impose trade embargoes, et cetera. It can choose to trade or not trade, and then impose secondary sanctions, even in circumstances, now thinking of the JCPOA, where it itself is in breach of the relevant international legal arrangement JCPOA entered into and with a series of other states backstopped by the Security Council, but it imposes secondary sanctions on other countries' ability to trade. And now in Cuba, even going beyond that and interdicting, imposing a fuel blockade that involves a physical limitation of other countries' ability to trade with Cuba, all of which is presented as somehow within gray zones or permissible or lawful, so that we see not just Israel imposing explicitly the Gazification of South Lebanon, announcing the use of the same doctrines and its targeting practices in Iran, but also the US, as you've indicated, embracing targeting strategies and others globally, beyond even the Middle East theater, that reflect this. So it's the culmination again, I just want to say, this is again our continuity and rupture story, both the culmination of a set of trends that we've seen now for, sadly, a quarter century, but also something that represents genuinely rupture because of the qualitative difference of scale at this point. But Aziz.
Aziz, I know you want to come in, but if you don't mind, since we only have literally 2 minutes left, I'm going to ask a last question and give that to you, which is that at the end of your fantastic piece, you guys leave us with perhaps a little bit of a hope, because you said in all of the variations of American power since World War II, there is one approach that remains genuinely untested: multipolarity on inclusive terms rather than through imperial rivalry. Such an approach would ground itself, and I'm cutting a bit, a vision of a world organized around mutual self-constraint, collective decision-making, and shared global commons. Aziz, is multipolarity in the US's national interest?
So my own view is absolutely that one of the things that we've actually seen over the course of these decades is that the particular path that the US is pursuing internationally, so a world that's organized around a harsh divide between insiders and outsiders, that thinks of resources as not a matter of the commons, but as something to be hoarded, that views law purely instrumentally as something that applies to our enemies, but we ourselves are lawless, has created domestically a culture of impunity that benefits the few and that compromises our own basic system of democracy. And that in truth, I think the lesson to be learned here is that the post-war vision of American primacy ultimately, in many ways, ate itself, because of the fact that it was always, in some ways, built around a presumption of defection. In 1973, Arthur Schlesinger was talking about the imperial president. We had investigations into the kinds of violence that was being imposed abroad, the forms of national security abuse that we saw domestically with the intelligence surveillance of various kinds of civil rights and anti-war organizations. So that primacy didn't actually generate something like a national interest. And now what we're witnessing with Trump is that a vision of multipolarity that's really just about old-fashioned imperial rivalry, and whoever has the biggest stick in whichever neighborhood, if it's Israel in the Middle East or the US in the Americas, being able to assert a kind of extreme dominance. Not only is that something that is bound to fail because people will inevitably reject like their own condition of permanent suffering and the presumption that folks do not have a right to self-determination, but it also produces societies internally, and we're seeing this within the US, that are not built to actually address the basic prevailing social crises and problems that people face that can actually produce something like equal and effective freedom. So really, multipolarity that presumes that a global commons should be a place for the sharing of wealth, that understands imposing constraints on oneself as a mechanism for creating a world in which constraint becomes a basic norm, is essential. And maybe just as a way of saying, as a final point, this is also why I think that the four elements of what we've seen tested out in Gaza post October 7th have to be named and rejected. One, the idea that you can just engage in assassination of folks that are not military figures. So just assassination of academics, journalists, politicians. Two, that you can imagine that the world can be organized as closed ethno-national communities. We're seeing this now in Lebanon. The New York Times reporting the idea that Israel is calling for Christian communities in the south to essentially remove Shia who have enjoyed something like safe haven there. So essentially demographically alter the terms of society so that each space is just for one ethnic community. The third is the idea that laws of war are really just opportunities for the imposition of extreme violence, including the attacking of civilian infrastructure and civilians. And then fourth, that we can think of things like sanctions and blockades as a legitimate form of making economies scream. All of these have been generalized in ways that now the US is effectively pursuing globally, from Cuba to Iran, and that each one of these elements make it impossible to live in a world with others. And so not only are the kinds of legal constraints essential to what we might think of as the US national interest, I'd say something else, which is that empire ultimately, 19th century empire, was ultimately not only not in the national interest of the actual people in parts of the global north, but it was also a deeply morally corroded way of being in the world. And that at the end of the day, it doesn't just matter what realpolitik strategic interests are or what the law says, but it matters what kind of ethical community we want to share with others. And to the extent that we've reached a place where in the United States, we're not even able to have a full-throated conversation about the kind of moral universe we want to inhabit, is an indicator both of the long trajectory that has brought us to this place, but also the particular forms of coercion that mark this moment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aslı and Aziz. Really recommend everyone to go to bostonreview.net and find the article. It's also linked on our website on the very invitation that you all saw when you signed up for this webinar. It's been a fantastic conversation. We look so much forward to having you back, hopefully a more hopeful article next time. But this is such an amazing contribution to our broader understanding of why we are where we are right now. Before I let everyone go, and I'm sorry that we're a couple of minutes over, I just want to make sure I plug our next webinar, which is actually quite related to this. It is tomorrow at 2 o'clock. It is titled, "What is the New Paradigm of U.S.-Venezuela Relations Post-Maduro?" And it features Francisco Rodriguez, Julia Buxton, and Orlando Perez. For those of you who are not signed up to the Quincy mailing list, please go to quincyinst.org. Sign up for the mailing list so you get invitations to all of our webinars, events, as well as our publications. And with that, thank you all again and hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much,
much.
Pika.
Thank you.